Why have we decided that something being familiar is the same as something being funny? If you recognize a cameo in a movie within the context of a comedic tone, your instinct is often to call out and make known your recognition of whatever character it is. And more than often it'll be within the form of laughter, even if it's sarcastically, even if you're kind of annoyed by this familiarity trope. The most common natural reaction is to have some extension of a joyous outburst. Now, why is our reaction to familiarity often in the form of amusement or joy? This might lead us to believe that references in the form of entertainment are inherently funny, which they aren't. We've entered a very lazy era in entertainment where things are massively rewarded for being nostalgic and recognizable, way more than being new and unique. It began with remakes and sequels and reboots being the more profitable productions of the past decade. Video games and movies have been around long enough now that we can cash in on the past eras and the nostalgia of old films, old games. And a lot of these products can be really inspired and well made, don't get me wrong, but they are also inherently easy to sell. Consumers are really stubborn, and it's a lot easier to sell someone something that they already know they're going to like, as opposed to getting them to try something new. Familiarity sells, but as companies and producers begin to pay attention to that, they start to ingrain it deeper and deeper into the products that we consume. It reaches beyond just being the concept or premise as to why you're making something and gets into even the writing and the directing. Why try to convince your audience that you said something funny when you can just as easily call back to something that they already found funny without having to put the work in? Taking someone else's creation and disguising it as your own joke is a lot easier than sitting down and thoughtfully writing out a payoff and a joke and a punchline. This approach can be lazy. It tends to only bring short-term success in the overall lifetime of a product. References only survive within the context of the world that they were created in. As time passes, familiarity and memory of a certain thing fades away, and eventually your pop culture reference will just end up being some really obscure inside joke that future audiences won't even get. And yet, despite that, people and companies are still continuing to adopt this method of humor, and it almost leads them towards this impending obscurity. To understand this unhealthy attraction that writers and directors are headed towards, it's more important to focus on why it's manipulative on an emotional level, or why it can be at least. Us as an audience finding references or cameos funny isn't just because we have some cheap sense of humor or are really easy to please. It's kind of ingrained into how humans think anyway when they're encountering something familiar. It's deeply ingrained in our mental state just in general to have strong reactions to resurfacing memories or when we recognize something familiar. Familiarity and comedy are very intertwined in that way. Like if you're out on your usual day and you go into the store and you recognize a friend that you didn't expect to see, we have a strong reaction to that. It's the same thing as seeing a character in a film where you didn't expect to see them. Our instinct tends to be, in both of those situations, to call out or have some kind of a joyous outburst. Maybe even to make fun of the person for seeing them in the store. But it's always a positive kind of energy. You might even chuckle or laugh out loud at seeing someone you recognize where you didn't expect to see them. Of course, our reaction is completely dependent on the person and where we see them and how likely it is that we would see them there. Running into a close friend that you didn't expect to see at a time you didn't expect to see them in a location that you didn't expect them to be is going to invoke a much more visceral reaction than if you see your coworker outside the place that you both work. This is pretty much the same mental connection that you make when you recognize a cameo or a popular reference in a film. As soon as your brain puts together that you're seeing something familiar in a place you didn't expect to see it, you're just automatically compelled to have some sort of outward reaction. Going back to the example of seeing a coworker outside the place that you both work at, when you expect to see them, you're going to have a much more reserved reaction because it isn't a coincidence, it's not unexpected by any means. We might still be happy to see the person depending on our personal relationship with them, but even if it's a best friend, if you see them when and where you expect to, it's not going to have nearly as visceral a reaction. So bringing that back to applying it to movies, you would expect that if you're seeing a cameo or a reference in a film you really didn't expect to see it, that's when you would have the most reaction. And maybe when you see something familiar in a context you would expect to see it, you shouldn't have one. But people aren't reacting this way anymore. So let's take something, for example, where the whole film, the whole premise of it is cameos and references. It's like a big crossover. Something that has a story and a premise that's completely transparent about the fact that it's going to have familiar properties and cameos all throughout of it, and in fact probably spoils them ahead of time with previews and trailers. You know going into that film that what you're going to be seeing is familiar. And yet, despite knowing all this information ahead of time, writers and producers are still expecting us to have this massive visceral reaction when that character or that property finally appears on screen in a film we know we're going to see them in at a time we know that they're going to appear. We're still struck by these things, even though we were completely aware ahead of time that they're going to be there. We still have that reaction. And this isn't just for comedy, although this video primarily is focusing on how it's used in humor or comedic films. It's something that you can use to get a reaction out of people in any facet of entertainment that a film can produce. It can induce pretty much any emotional experience that you could experience when watching a movie. Now, this isn't inherently bad, and even in a lot of the examples that I might show in the background, there's going to be plenty of movies and games where the references are non-intrusive. The overall creative work might have any amount of merit beyond just the cameos themselves, and be perfectly good works of art, but we've strayed kind of beyond that, and there tends to be an ever-growing trend of the whole premise of not only the films and games, but the whole premise of the jokes is the references just for the sake of references. It's become the directive of a lot of entertainment media that we consume. So having kind of explained like the mental gymnastics of how this manipulation can work, we can see how it's used in media and probably call up a lot of our own examples of things that we've personally experienced that kind of fit that bill. But seeing as you can apply the word manipulation to it in some circumstances, it's probably good to define why it's a negative. Why is tapping into a basic human emotion that we already have built into us such a criminal offense that I would discuss it to the extent that I'm discussing it? A contrary opinion might even argue that in order for us to laugh or have any emotional reaction whatsoever to something, there has to be some level of recognizability to it. Understanding and empathy are nearly requirements for us as an audience to be fully engaged in a plot or character. Who can relate to deities that are portrayed a lot in films nowadays that are just these perfect, unreachable standards of a human? You really can't. If you had a character that was so godlike that they were unachievable as a human, you wouldn't be able to relate to them. Writers and directors are almost forced to introduce human flaws into such powerful characters just so that they're somewhat relatable for us, and then we can actually root for them and care about what happens to them. Even the most far-fetched fictional story imaginable has to have at least an inkling of relatability and recognizability for us to actually get invested in the universe. This ideology works on a really broad scale. It's an overarching rule of thumb for entertainment media, but you can even use a more precise example to kind of understand it, something a little more specific. So if you have, let's say, somebody who grew up on a farm who had to work a lot and never got things handed out to them for free, they're going to relate a lot more to a movie or a character that portrays a similar upbringing than they would to, say, some kid who was born into royalty and had things handed to them. Just within the context of these straw man characters I've made up. People just naturally find it way easier to become immersed with a character in a story if it has some relation to how they actually see the world. Of course, familiarity and nostalgia aren't required for us to like something or to find it interesting or even to become fully invested in it, but I can guarantee you that if you chose your favorite character, your favorite movie, somewhere in there's going to be an inkling of recognizability that you can relate with. I guarantee that on some level, even subconsciously, there is something that you relate with there. Even like super unrealistic action heroes might have just the moral standpoint of protecting what they care about. And that in itself can be enough for us to relate to a character. Just a character trying to survive can even just be that inkling of a like-minded connection that allows you to be immersed in that character or the story that they're in. So if understanding and spotting familiarity is important to enjoying any work of art, why is it somewhat criminal in certain circumstances for comedy to use it in the way that it does? Seeing as it's just a natural tendency, is it really inherently wrong? No, but an overarching relatability, when attempted in a disingenuous way, can drive viewers away more than it can entice us. Finding out that a friend has had a similar experience to you and relates to you on some level can be really uplifting, and that can be something a person can bond over, but if some random stranger approaches you on the street and says, hey, just from the looks of you, I can judge that you've had this experience, and I have also had this experience, and so you and I, we're not so different, and we're relating to ourselves in some way, when they don't even know you, and they have no idea any of the experiences you've had, you might even jump to being offended that they would just automatically assume that your experience and and who you are is so simple and easy to see that any random person can just walk up to you and say, hey, I relate to you on this level. That could be something that can come across as really pretentious to a person. It almost downplays your existence and your experiences. Anyone that assumes that our mental tendencies are so simple that any random person can draw us to believing that they're just like us is kind of insulting. Relating back to the topic at hand, when a movie presents us with a familiar entity and just expects us to oblige in laughter just because we recognize it, it's almost broadly assuming that we are simple, we're like everyone else, and they can just randomly guess what we're going to find funny and randomly assume that we'll recognize something. And a lot of the time, for me anyway, I'll become quickly defensive and annoyed by such an unfounded assumption. Although it actually might be true, I don't want to think that. The idea that I would feel a joyous emotion just because the movie that I'm watching randomly guessed that I would understand a reference whose context is outside the movie that I'm consuming almost downplays my ability to be entertained otherwise. Sometimes it's almost like we're laughing at a reference just to let out some sigh of relief like, wow, thank goodness I recognize this. Thank goodness I had the previous knowledge to recognize what this movie was referencing, because if I didn't, I might have missed out on an entire scene, potentially, of the film. I might have missed out on a joke. I might have not understood what the film was trying to get across if I didn't happen to randomly have this knowledge that this movie assumed that I would have. And it's the truth, isn't it, that movies are suddenly relying more and more on our knowledge of pop culture and current references that 30 years from now, if you take a grown adult who has a fully functional brain and a perfect understanding of the world that they live in, and you sit them down and you have them watch movies that were made today or within the past decade, they would probably understand 20% less of the movie than if they were born and around today. It makes the products age kind of horribly. A common rule of thumb when making a sequel or an adaptation of an existing IP is to present it in a way that anybody who hasn't experienced the original product can still understand and enjoy something. So if you're taking a character from a comic book and adapting them into a movie, then you would have to make it so that just moviegoers who haven't experienced the comics can still watch and understand and enjoy the product without needing this outside context or this extra knowledge that they might not have. This allows a product to be enjoyed by everyone, not just the people who have experienced the product before. And why shouldn't we have the same rule apply to individual scenes or jokes within films? The more your creation relies on current knowledge, the worse it's going to age when that knowledge becomes obsolete. Okay, so a person might argue that if this supposed crime against entertainment in media is so blatantly negative that it leads to a poor aging product, then why would anyone continue to commit said crime? If it's such a cheap trick with diminishing returns, why continue to perform it? Well, for one thing, cameos in movies just existing for the sake of themselves has only recently become a popular trend. The data really has yet to come in that this trend will statistically show a drop in interest as time goes on. And once those numbers do come in, if they come in, I guess this is mostly just theorizing at the moment, but once they do finally come in, then maybe producers and companies would take action or take notice of that when the money starts to drop. But for now, it's just a theory. It's just me discussing it in a YouTube channel. It's just the broad majority of people noticing an overarching, looming trend that's growing more and more annoying every day. So we can speculate going off general tendencies and trends. But until those actual numbers come in years and years from now, I don't think most companies are going to be bothered to change anything. It's making them money right now in the short term. Beyond that, paying a monetary fee to include someone else's character in your film is a lot easier than finding some intelligent writer to actually create a smart character or a smart setup. Why bother writing a thoughtful setup for a gag when you can simply insert reference and pretty much get the same reaction that you would have gotten anyway? And a lot of the popular properties today are being owned by fewer and fewer companies, so if you're some big movie producer, you can just grab from your massive pre-existing collection of properties that you bought over the years and just say, well, we can just choose one, we don't have to pay for them anymore. And even if you do have intelligent writers, those writers don't need to take as much time to do their job if you can just blatantly throw a reference at it. This might come across as a little bit harsh, so I do want to make it clear that my intentions when defining the ideas are to critique the ideas themselves, not specific films or specific companies that I might add in the background during editing. I've chosen when writing my notes for this not to use very specific examples for anything, not to reference anything by name, because I just want to address the ideas of it, how bad it can become, and how it can be done well. Not to point out how bad specific films are or to say how much I personally dislike a specific product. Most of what I'm defining as lazy or criminal are just broad assumptions about the ideas of doing these things, not specific products, and many of the things that I show in editing will be maybe not exact, perfect examples of what I'm talking about because of that. I'm just trying to keep the focus on the ideas themselves. Or at least that's my sly way of avoiding any specific critiques of any particular media, and having to consume 50 different movies to make this and make very specific references. I'll just cower in fear behind my non-specific rants for now. I'll also share that in my own experiences consuming the media that I'm referring to and experiencing movies with references and cameos, I have the exact same reaction that the writers and producers expect me to have. I'm not going to act like I'm above engaging with something or finding it funny just because it might be low effort or easy. So with all the potential negatives and possibly unintended consequences of falling into the trap of easy writing out of the way, it should probably be clarified that these things can be done well. It's still completely possible to use these methods correctly to produce something that is respectfully funny and still well-aging. Although I personally don't find it as funny as most people, fourth wall humor is inherently that. Simply a reference to the fact that what you're watching isn't real. And when done with a proper setup and done unexpectedly, it can avoid being manipulative or condescending altogether. At the end of the day, using a cameo to get a reaction out of an audience is just the same thing as using any tool to accomplish whatever it is you want to accomplish. It only becomes manipulative or criminal when someone doesn't take the proper approach or respect. So as questionable as it might sound, I've personally observed that as the human race as a whole consumes more and more entertainment media and more personalities on the internet, we get better at detecting disingenuousness, even if subconsciously. Watching a personality on the internet that you don't truly know on a personal level can lead our minds to be better at estimating what the people we watch are actually like. And a lot of this comes through a sort of trial and error process. We observe a person's behavior from a distance, and then we automatically just form some random opinion about this person, whether or not we think they're good or egotistical or nice or kind or any of these things, and then eventually somewhere down the line we might be given the answer as to whether or not those assumptions are actually true. And then we can finally say whether or not we were right or wrong, and whether we notice it or not, our brains make adjustments based on those answers. Many of us have been watching video producers and streamers long enough now that we've seen many examples of people appearing a certain way and then ending up not being the way that we expected them. And when we see those things play out, even if we think someone's a bad person and they turn out not to be, our brains are subconsciously adapting to notice those tendencies. The tendencies that maybe make you a good person or a generous person or an egotistical person or a selfish person. It's the same thing with knowing people in real life. We can get that same effect over the internet. We can start to more easily notice tendencies as someone who is truthful or someone who has something to hide. And this adaptation that our brains make to noticing these things can also apply to the topic at hand, the broader realm of creative media. Movies that many people worked on, we can still notice in what they produce whether or not those people were genuine or respectful in the creation that they were making, whether or not they were even putting effort into it. So for instance, it might be a lot easier than you think to notice when a callback is written in by someone who doesn't fully understand what they're calling back to. Even in premise, most of us can spot when there's a tactic at play as opposed to genuine inspiration, completely regardless of whether or not we actually enjoy the finished product or if it's good or not. As this trend grows ever looming, I notice myself becoming more perturbed and offended by reference humor when I experience it outside of the actual media. So if I see social media posts about it, trailers, previews, I will become more offended when I see that it's just blatant reference humor than I will when I actually sit down and watch the movie. And most of the time, if I do sit down and consume a product that has references, as I said, I still engage and oblige with laughing at it or whatever reaction it is that the producers want me to have. I do still tend to produce the same reactions, but I've noticed that like seeing clips on Twitter or seeing previews, I will become more offended and find them way less funny. Now, this could be myself being sumptuous and not giving things the benefit of the doubt. It could be a well-founded reaction. I know other people have shared similar ones with me, but it could also be a broad statement on trailers and previews in general. Most of the time, they're not a very good representation of what you're going to be watching anyway. But that could be a topic for another time. I don't want to digress too much into critiquing previews and trailers, the issues we might have with those. And by this point, we've spent more time discussing a goofy pop culture trope than it probably deserves. The vast majority of experiences that we are going to have in terms of humor, making people laugh, saying you're doing something funny, is going to be completely irrelevant to these rules of thumb that you might apply to movies or video production. When socializing with friends or family in an impromptu casual setting, or even interacting with an audience during a live stream, the rules of what is and isn't funny are completely different and are completely defined by the individuals in the room. If you laugh, it's funny, and if you don't laugh, then who cares why? Despite the fact that I'm the person making this video, I've always found that critiques and rules of thumb for comedy and dissecting the ways that we find things funny to be kind of pretentious and often not very useful. You can discuss and lay down as many rules and regulations as you can possibly muster based on past experiences and what people have found funny in the past, but it's completely useless at the end of the day. For most of us, laughing and goofing around with friends or family is going to be the peak of our need to say or do something funny. Like, who in their right mind gives any thought to how well a joke is going to age when we're all just making fart jokes at Jose's birthday party? Even in the more formal world of scripted videos, movies, and production, it's up to the joke maker's discretion to decide if what they're putting forth is worth putting forth. And even further still, it's up to the individual audience member to decide if what they're watching is worth a laugh. Even if we keep a really tight regimen on the do's and don'ts of what we allow ourselves to do in the form of comedy, at the end of the day, a person could still decide that if something they're putting out isn't going to age well, maybe it's funny enough at the time that it is worth just having a extremely potent, maybe poorly aging, but immediately very funny joke. Maybe that's what they want to accomplish. You can simply just not care if something ages well. If something is so immediately potent in the moment, maybe you just don't care about how well it ages 20 years from now, or how entertaining future people that you're never going to meet are going to find your creation. You might even say that that essentially dismantles any valid reason we might have for discussing this to begin with, if it can all be narrowed down to just, you do you. But I do think there's still a lot to be said with paying attention to how we conduct ourselves if we're ever tasked with the creation of entertainment media. When we conjure any creative media or put any amount of effort into a project, we should still have standards for ourselves. We can still have valid critiques of what we see as potentially unhealthy practices. The further we stray from high effort, the closer we inch to lazy cop-outs. And as history shows in every single decision ever made, sometimes taking that little bit of extra effort can make the big difference in terms of how your creation is seen years from now. Despite rules being a useless factor in the grand scheme of subjective entertainment, holding ourselves to a higher standard than our natural human tendency can only ever result in being at least one step closer to whatever amount of legacy a person can hope to achieve. So that's me complaining for a while. Thanks for watching. As you can tell, I hate all movies, and you should too. Don't let anyone enjoy anything, and I'm right and you're wrong. Goodbye.
We'll be right back.